Hello again. I am William Campbell, also known as Bill Shears. I am now Paul McCartney. Today I would like to go into more detail of my time as Paul McCartney. It was a well-known fact that Paul McCartney had a prehensile tail. Paul always loved to use his tail to swing or simply hang from trees or other elevated objects like lampposts or buildings. Not a lot of people know that. In Paul's early days at the Cavern in Liverpool, he would use his 5-foot-long tail to support himself on stage, especially when he had had a long day and was tired. Brian Epstein suggested to Paul that he should wrap the tail over his shoulder and use it as a guitar strap. Paul tried this for a while but soon gave it up because using his tail as a guitar strap became painful due to bad blood circulation, which often caused him to faint on stage during a performance, and besides, Paul liked to stretch his tail now and again. Eventually, Brian Epstein persuaded Paul to have his prehensile tail surgically removed. Paul missed his tail for a long time but soon got used to the idea of having no tail. Thank goodness Paul did get rid of his tail before he died in 1966. I don't think I could have faced standing in for Paul with his 5-foot-long tail. Dealing with my own hunchback and clubbed foot was enough, and the idea of also coping with a tail would have been just too much for me. Paul wrote a song for his tail entitled "This Is My Tail," the lyrics of which you can find on the internet. I remember some of the words. This is my tail and it's not for sale. I lean on you, my tail. I lean on you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There was also Paul's hair to deal with. Being as bald as a coot myself from an early age, there was no way I could compete with Paul in the mop stakes. Brian Epstein again suggested I should have a hair transplant, but in the end he agreed to allowing me to wear a wig. Over the years as Paul McCartney, I have had to wear many different wigs. The types of wigs I had to wear were dictated by the fashion at the time. As my time as Paul McCartney passed, hair got shorter and shorter. Different looks came and went. Sadly for me, the bald look never really caught on, so I am still wearing wigs today. Of course, I had to pay for all the wigs I wore out of my own pocket. A not well-known piece of Paul McCartney trivia is that I originally wanted to call my new band Wigs instead of Wings, but Denny Lane talked me out of it. Another episode in time as Paul McCartney occurred in late 1966. Brian Epstein approached me one day and said, "You're too small and your face is too round. You need to change your height and face shape." I replied, "I beg your pardon. What did you just say?" Brian repeated exactly what he had said. "You're too small and your face is too round. You need to change your height and face shape." I was totally mystified. Brian said, "You look like Paul, but your height is wrong and your footy is too round." I told Brian I could increase the size of my shoe lifts by another few inches. They were already 4 inches. I was 5 feet 2 inches tall with my lifts, but Brian said I was still too small. I then asked Brian what did he suggest I do. Brian told me that I'd need a good stretching. Still mystified, I asked Brian how did he propose to give me a good stretching as he had said earlier. Brian said nothing. A few weeks later, Brian told me that he had signed me into a local clinic in Harley Street. Harley Street is a street in Marylebone, central London, famous for doctors and other medical personnel. Brian told me I would go to the clinic to be stretched and have my face made longer. At this stage I had had enough, and in no uncertain terms I told Brian to go fuck himself. Brian said bluntly that if I didn't cooperate and do as I was told, I would be disposed of just like the original Paul was disposed of. I told Brian that unless John, George and Ringo underwent the same stretching treatment as me at the Harley Street Clinic, then I would not cooperate. Finally Brian agreed, and a week or so later John, George and Ringo were taken in black van to Harley Street to the clinic of a doctor called Maxwell, who specialized in increasing people's heights by stretching. The treatment entailed all four of us being put on the rack and stretched. It lasted several weeks and had different results. George could not be stretched and Ringo was stretched but shrank back to his original height. As for John, he had been certified unfit to undergo the treatment by his own doctor and was excused by Brian from undergoing any stretching treatment. Whether John was swinging the lead or bluffing I do not know, but I felt it would be typical of John to worm his way out of having to be stretched. As for me, after a few weeks of treatment I was stretched an extra 12 inches. Brian said it was too much, so I had to go back to the clinic and be shrunk a few inches. During the shrinking treatment in the rack my kneecaps were blown off, but I had been shrunk about 2 inches down to 10 inches. Brian said he was happy with 10 inches any day of the week. John, George and Ringo left the clinic and I was the last to hobble out 10 inches taller and with no kneecaps. I later underwent treatment to have kneecaps reinserted.